Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the rather heavy topic of the anatomy of the cerebellum, thalamus, hypothalamus, and the brainstem. And then in between, we'll have a lecture on clinical symptoms, because I think that's more interest to you all, something interesting for you to follow. It will be not so heavy. And then we move on to things like the basal ganglia, striatum, some other bit more heavier topics. All right. In between, we'll have some short breaks. Okay. So let's begin first with the first lecture. Now, I am using PDF, unfortunately. Sorry about that, because somehow the previous slides were stuck in a previous laptop of mine. All right. So basically, now our first morning lecture will be on the cerebellum, thalamus, hypothalamus, and brainstem. So as we move down with this, okay. Now, just to recap what we learned during my previous lecture when I introduced you to the brain surfaces, okay, just to recall, remember we learned about the cerebrum. Now, the cerebrum, is divided into frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes, which each have specific functions. The frontal lobe is involved in motor function. The motor cortex is located in the frontal lobe. And you have your supplementary and premotor areas, which are involved in planning, coordination, and integration of this motor function. Then you have the parietal lobe, which is responsible for sensory function, how you perceive and various sensory input, vision, hearing, taste, so on and so forth. And then you have your temporal lobe, and particularly the auditory association area is located in the temporal lobe. And the occipital lobe, which is responsible for vision and its visual processing. Now, later on today, we will learn a little bit more how a problem in these different parts of the brain will result in a sort of spectrum of neurological deficits. That's the part of my clinical lecture. So for this morning, we are going to look at some things that lie deeper inside, all right? So just like the cerebrum, we have the cerebellum, right? That's this structure located at the bottom. So today's lecture is basically about what lies beneath the surface. So beneath the cortical surface of the cerebrum, we find that there are areas of deep gray matter or nuclei, which are known as the thalamus. This big red structure is right in the middle of the brain. And you will find out through my lecture later on why the structure is located in the center of the brain, because it's part related to its function. Just below the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus, which also is another important integrative center of the brain. Now, connected to the thalamus and the hypothalamus is the brainstem. The brainstem is the center of all activity in our brain. It is responsible for consciousness and contains important centers for breathing and heart function, and then also has the nuclei of the cranial nerves. Remember in my introductory lecture, I explained to you about the 12 cranial nerves and how they function to supply the muscles and all the sensation to our face and head and neck, all right? And lastly, at the back here, you have the hindbrain, or known as the cerebellum. So we'll start with the easiest thing first. So we're going to talk about the cerebellum first. All right. Here's just another view of the structures that I spoke of. Thalamus, hypothalamus, and here's the brainstem, which consists of the midbrain, which is right in the center of the brain. Naturally, hence it's called the midbrain. Between the midbrain and then you have the pons, and lower down is the medulla oblongata. And at the back is the cerebellum, okay? So now, before we go on to the details of the lecture, let's talk about something that, which I have encountered over the years lecturing students. There is actually a clinical condition known as neurophobia. I'm sure most of you are also having that symptoms right now. Am I correct? Yeah, exactly, right on. When you hear neuroanatomy, you get afraid. No, you're not. Okay, very good, Shamil. All right. But a lot of doctors and a lot of young doctors and trainees who are learning have this fear of, utilizing their knowledge, especially when they're faced with a patient with a neurological problem, because it's rather complicated, they feel. But, and this has been actually been described and published before. And goes back to always the lack of basic neuroanatomy and neurophysiology knowledge. Now, why am I sharing this? Of course, it's definitely more relevant to young doctors. However, I'm sharing this with you for you to understand that neuroanatomy is the building blocks of understanding of neurology and neurological conditions. All right. So why, even though it may seem a bit tedious in the early stages, this is like a, your very basic um, scaffolding for your future career in neuro or new brain related sciences. So just something to remember, because unfortunately we will not, I don't think we want to see this happen right now. We have to use an app for every single thing. So hopefully we don't get to this point. All right. Okay, so moving on. Now the cerebellum is a structure that is found in various mammalians, not just in human beings. I'm showing you this picture and to show you the relative size of the cerebellum. And now if you realize, cerebrum in some of these organisms are rather small, but you notice the relative size of the cerebellum is way much bigger, particularly in, like, see, in frogs, in amphibians, in fish, and even in birds, relative to the size of the brain. That sort of should tell you the kind of role that the cerebellum plays in motor function. Because if we were to compare the dexterity, the speed of movement, how fast we change movement, how quickly we move, and how smoothly, I think one might be able to argue that these other organisms tend to have an advantage over us, and that is where and how the cerebellum plays a role in motor function. We will explore a little bit further. Now, before we go into that, I just want to touch a little bit about brain embryology. Right? How does the brain develop? Now, the brain originates from a tube, a long tube known as the neural tube. During when your development of when the embryo is inside the mother's womb, it forms a neural tube, and all the neural structures arise from here. Now, if you observe the slide that I've posted, see what happens is parts of the tube, the rostral portion or the anterior portion, develops into vesicles. Vesicles are fluid-filled cyst-like structures, right? And these vesicles are, in the early stage, they are known as primary brain vesicles. They are divided into just three vesicles: the proencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon. The proencephalon, or the forebrain, will give rise to the cerebrum, that is the telencephalon, and which will give rise to the cerebral cortex, right? And some of the basal nuclei. Now, the diencephalon is the one we're going to be learning about today. The deeper structures consist of the thalamus and hypothalamus and epithalamus, right? Similarly, the mesencephalon sort of remains the same, and it divides into the brainstem, the midbrain. The hindbrain, the rhombencephalon, on the other hand, will divide. I know these are all very terminological, but just for you to understand how the development occurs, why something is outside, why something is inside, right? So the rhombencephalon, or the hindbrain, is the one that's going to give rise to the cerebellum, and also parts of the brainstem, which is the pons and medulla oblongata. And the other end of the tube, right, the neural tube, will differentiate into the spinal cord. So it all starts off as one long tube. The anterior portion sort of forms different vesicles, and these expand to form the brain. All right, and along the way, from being straight, it starts to tilt forward, which is why sometimes when you look at your neuroanatomy textbook, you might be wondering why something is labeled dorsal but is on top, because originally it was like this. Ventral describes what is in front, dorsal is at the back. But when the neural tube bends, naturally what is located dorsal now is actually on top. So that's why sometimes you find this confusing terminology in your neuroanatomy textbooks. Guys, are you able to follow what I'm saying so far? Is it clear? I know it's a bit of a heavy topic, so I can always repeat if you'd like.
Can, doctor.
Can, Okay, good. I mean, just keep focus on the slides, and we can move forward slowly. All right. So now, and as I mentioned, remember, it's a tube. So the center of the tube contains fluid, And these fluid filled areas, as the cysts develop, they give rise to something known as the ventricular system in the brain. Right? These are water-filled chambers inside the brain that play an important role in how nutrition is provided to the brain, sort of cooling and buoyancy to the brain. Okay, we will not go into that, but essentially, see, this is how the brain sort of develops into the various structures. Okay, and remember I was talking to you, see, it is a tube that forms these vesicles that differentiate into different portions. Basically, initially, it will be just divided into three: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. And then the forebrain and hindbrain will further develop. Forebrain give rise to telencephalon and diencephalon. Hindbrain will give rise to the cerebellum, metencephalon, metencephalon, and myelencephalon. All right, metencephalon is the medulla oblongata, myelencephalon is the spine. So, and eventually at birth, it actually becomes this complicated structure. Do not worry, this is just for understanding. So now this imagery is basically a little bit more detail on the functions and all, but I think what is more important is let's move on into the anatomy. Okay. So the cerebellum, as I mentioned to you, is a part of the hindbrain at the back here. All right. Now the skull is divided into three fossa or spaces. All right. So the frontal lobe sits on what is known as the anterior cranial fossa. That's where you can see, number one, the olfactory nerves run. The temporal lobe sits on an area known as the posterior fossa. The middle cranial fossa. All right. And the cerebellum is located at the back here in an area known as the posterior fossa. All right. At the bottom. So if you look at the cerebellum, you'll notice it's a bit triangular in shape. Essentially, it can be divided anatomically into three main lobes. The anterior lobe, right? This green posterior lobe, and this smaller orange lobe known as the floccular nodular lobe. The anterior and posterior lobes are divided by something known as the primary fissure. So in the brain, this is how it looks, but if you unroll it, this is basically how it looks. And these lobes are rightfully divided in such a way, they also have a variation in terms of their function. All right, which we will come to shortly. So remember, the cerebellum can be divided into an anterior lobe, a posterior lobe, and a floccular nodular lobe. All right. At the same time, these lobes, they also have further differentiation in the sense that the mid portion, the midline area, the center area is known as the cerebellar vermis, and the edge, the lateral half of the cerebellum is known as the hemisphere. So the vermis, just like the structures in the center controls the central structures in our body, right? Our trunk. The parts of the hemisphere are more related to our limbs. Okay, just as a preview. We'll go into a bit more on the surfaces and lobes of the cerebellum and its internal structure and connections. Now, so this is a view of the lateral view of the cerebellum, which you have been looking at. So up here, you see this is known as the anterior lobe. Below is the posterior lobe, which is divided by the primary fissure. And here is the floccular, or part of the floccular nodular lobe. So the cerebellum is just located within the posterior fossa and lies behind the brainstem. So here in this image, you can actually see the brainstem together, and it actually connects to the brainstem through structures known as peduncles. Cerebellar peduncle. So here you can see the middle cerebral peduncle, which connects the cerebellum to the pons. You also have a superior cerebellar peduncle, not visible in this image, which connects the cerebellum to the midbrain, and an inferior cerebellar peduncle that connects the cerebellum to the medulla oblongata. Okay, so here's a different view of the cerebellum. We've been looking at it from the lateral view. Now we're looking at it from above. So from above, you can see the anterior lobe is located on top. Here's the primary fissure, and this is the posterior lobe. And this is from the front. You see the floccular nodular lobe here, and this is part of the posterior and anterior lobe. Okay, so what are the functions, and the locations and functions essentially of these three lobes? Now, the anterior lobe, as I said, sits above the primary fissure. It receives afferents from the spinal cord. Now, what does that mean? We have nerves that relay information about the position of our joints, right? The position of our limbs and feeling to our brain. And this information is carried also to not only to our motor cortex, but to our cerebellum. Because the cerebellum is involved in regulating movement. So only by knowing the position of our limbs will the cerebellum be able to perform its task of fine-tuning and regulating movement, smooth movement. If you didn't have a cerebellum, your movement will be like a robot. If you have to lift up your hand, imagine you will move your hand first like this, then you'll go like that, and you'll go like that. You will not have a smooth movement, right? So in order for the cerebellum to do this correctly, it needs to be able to have feedback about where the location of the limbs and the body is. So that's where the afferents from the spinal cord come in. This is just a brief one. We'll keep going. Posterior lobe of the cerebellum, right? It's below the primary fissure. This is the larger part of the cerebellum, and it receives afferent from the cerebral cortex. Now, the brain also needs to give information to the cerebellum about what actions it's ordering the body to do, right or not? So, see, this is why the brain orders a particular function. The feedback of how that movement is happening goes to the cerebellum from the spinal afferents. And using the balance mechanisms, information obtained through the floccular-nodular lobe, the cerebellum coordinates our movement, to ensure we have good balance and fine, smooth movement. So essentially, what you can see so far is the cerebellum is informed in balance, coordination, and maintaining smooth movement. So that's why some of the animals, that I showed you earlier today, like the fish, birds, and all, they tend to have very fast and smooth movement, right? It's important and essential for their survival, which is why they tend to have a relatively larger cerebellum in comparison to the size of their cerebrum. See, human beings, and we use the cerebrum more information processing, so hence our cerebrum is larger. Okay, just a fun fact for you guys. All right. Is everybody awake? I know you have a whole day of lecture, so good to see. You can put in some. If you guys have any questions so far about what I've just explained, would you like to put it into the chat function? Guys, anything, or can I continue on? Okay.
Doctor.
Yes.
I want to ask, during the development of the brain, is that the internal carotid arteries, ICA, developed together?
Okay, the ICA. Okay, very good question. Now, the vascular supply derives from a different. See, the embryo consists of three layers. You have your ectodermal, mesodermal, and endodermal derivatives. All neural tissue arises from the ectoderm, all right? And ectoderm gives rise to the neural tube. So, the vascular supply, the arteries come from mesodermal origin, all right? And yes, they do develop in tandem with the neural structures, but they don't come from the same original tissue.
Okay. Okay.
All right. I can highlight that to you a little bit later because it's veering off a little out of our thing, but I would be happy to do it a bit later. Okay, guys, we will slowly touch on. Let's try to finish this section. Okay. So when you take a knife and cut through the cerebellum, what will you see? See, just like the cerebrum, remember, you have an outer mass of gray matter, the cerebral cortex. Remember what it's made of? The neuronal cell bodies. And it's extensively folded to form what is known as folia, even more extensive than our cerebrum, right? And so much, and then within the center, you have this area of white matter. And so much so that on a cross section, the cerebellum has been likened to a tree, and it's been called the tree of life. Now, if you cut across the center, just like in the cerebrum, there are also some deep cerebellar nuclei, just like thalamus, hypothalamus. Basically, within the cerebellum also there are some deep nuclei that are involved in integration. So, I'll give you the name shortly. Now, remember earlier I mentioned about the connection between the cerebellum and the brainstem. So, these connections are known as the cerebellar peduncles. So there are three: a superior, middle, and inferior cerebellar peduncle that connects to the brainstem. The superior connects the cerebellum to the midbrain. The middle one connects the cerebellum to the pons, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle connects the cerebellum to the medulla oblongata. And here's a diagram of the blood supply. That is, you notice the cerebellum is supplied by so many different arteries. The larger portion is by something known as the superior cerebellar artery. And you also have the anterior inferior cerebellar and posterior inferior cerebellar artery. These are all arteries that come from what is known as the posterior circulation of the brain that originate from the vertebral arteries. All right. The anterior cerebral circulation is the blood supply that comes from the internal carotid arteries. Okay, so remember we spoke about the division of the cerebellum based on the lobes: anterior lobe, posterior lobe, and floccular nodular lobe. The cerebellum has also been divided in accordance to its function. All right. Now, I know this sounds like a lot of pronunciation, a lot of new terms, but let's just go through step by step. So we know that the cerebellum is has an important function in balance and coordination of movement, right or not? So, okay, part of the cerebellum, the floccular nodular lobe, and the central part of the cerebellum has been collectively also is known as the vestibulocerebellum. And as the name suggests, vestibule is the organ within our ear that is important in balance. So hence, this part of the cerebellum is particularly involved in the maintenance of our posture and balance. Then, subsequently, you have the spinocerebellum, which is basically the vermis, which is the midline area, and the intermediate zone just between the midline and the lateral portion. So, the spinocerebellum, as I explained earlier, gets afferent information about the position of our limbs, through the spinal receptors, and gives you basically is in coordinating how we move our limbs. All right. The cerebrocerebellum, on the other hand, is more of the lateral zone, and it is related to the input that comes from our higher cortical centers to our cerebellum, involving multi-step complex activities and how we are going to coordinate and function together smoothly. So you see, this is just another way that the cerebellum is divided. And when you look at it like that, see, the vestibulocerebellum is involved in balance and of course, yes, eye movements also. Because when you move your head, your eyes also have to move in a coordinated manner. Number two, then you have the spinocerebellum that regulates body and limb movements. And lastly, the cerebrocerebellum, which I mentioned, is involved in planning and initiation of movement, right? It's more of a cognitive function. So, you see, this is essentially how we are divided, either from an anatomical perspective or a functional perspective. Okay, this is just a diagrammatic representation of what I just explained to you. The floccular nodular lobe and part of the lingula will form the vestibulocerebellum. Predominantly, the anterior lobe is the spinocerebellum, involved in the regulation of muscle tone, coordination, skill movement, and planning of voluntary activity comes from the cerebrocerebellum. All right. Okay. I did mention to you there are 4 cerebellar nuclei. These are deep nuclei that are involved in, more detailed fine-tuning of these functions. They are named from lateral to medial. The dentate nucleus, emboliform nucleus, globose nucleus, and fastigial nucleus. in some textbooks they use the short form, don't eat greasy foods, but I leave it to you guys if you want to use this short form, because sometimes for me personally, I end up remembering the short form, but I forget what it stands for. All right, but up to you guys. So this is the names of the deep cerebellar nucleus from lateral to medial: dentate nucleus, emboliform nucleus, globose nucleus, and fastigial nucleus. So all the cortical afferents all enter the cerebellum, all right, are processed in the cerebellar cortex, and then they will relate to the nuclei, who there's only a single outflow tract or efferent from the cerebellum, and this is known as the Purkinje cells. From here, the Purkinje cells, they will pass through the superior cerebellar peduncle, all right, and then through the midbrain to parts of the thalamus and the motor cortex. Now, if you realize that, a lot of the superior cerebellar peduncle carries efferents outwards to the brain. The inferior cerebellar peduncle brings afferents from the spine to the cerebellum, and the pons has descending fibers from the brain going to the cerebellum. So you see, anatomically also everything is arranged in such a way it's easier lah. What is nearer the brain, that's the part that the fibers use. What is nearer the spine, that's the part that the spinal afferents use. Here you have an image showing you the connections of the cerebellum. So you notice that it has a connection with various structures, or thalamus, the brainstem. The inferior olive is where your hearing feedback comes from. Your red nucleus is involved in movements as well as eye movement. So see, they all correlate, they interact with the cerebellum, and that's how the cerebellum is able to control a wide variety of our movements, planning movements, as well as our balance function. Now, this was supposed to be a slide on PowerPoint, that's why it's come out a bit off, but let me just talk to you about this, and I'll show you in the other presentation what is a signs of cerebellar disorder. So if you have a problem with your cerebellum, naturally you understand that there are three things going to be affected. One is your balance. So when you have a problem with balance, what does the body do? It tries to widen your base, fair or not? Because the wider the base, the more stable you are. So those who have disorders of cerebellar function, they have something known as ataxia. Ataxia is basically when you walk with a wide base gait. That means you open up your legs wide to help you balance. All right. Then you have problems with fine coordinated activities. You are not able to do repeated alternating movements. Your speech will be affected. This is known as dysarthria. When you speak, the pronunciation is affected because the coordination of the movement of your tongue and your mouth is affected. I know some of these things have not been, blocked out, but basically, I will explain them to you. So this diadochokinesia is an inability to perform repeated alternating movements. Now, let me see whether I can temporarily switch to my video to show you. So basically, when we do this, we test in clinical practice, we ask the patient to tap alternatively on their hands and see whether, I don't know whether you can see my video. All right. We do this. We ask them to do this. Tap alternatingly on their hands and, see whether they can do this. So those with cerebellar problems will have problems doing this alternating movement. Another thing we do is something called a finger nose test. We tell the patient to touch their nose and touch our finger. And you have to do this on back and forth. So a person with a cerebellar problem, you will find that they are not able to hit the target correctly. They'll overshoot because their ability to gauge, and perform a smooth movement is affected. This is known as dysmetria. Now, similarly, nystagmus is abnormal movement of the eyes, because what happens is the ability of the eye to move smoothly and focus gets affected if the cerebellum is affected. So naturally, the eyes move around here and there, and that's why there's jerky movements of the eye when there's a cerebellar problem. Sometimes they can even develop fine tremors of the hands when they're trying to do something, because, as I said, the regulation of movement is affected. So the cerebellum doesn't keep everything, in such fine control. Classically, people have considered the cerebellum to be purely an area which is involved with movement, balance, planning movement only. But in recent times, we actually found that there's something called cerebellar cognitive efferent syndrome, all right, where it affects cerebellar conditions can also affect executive function like planning, verbal fluency, reasoning, working memory, and also spatial cognition, your grammar, and you can also have effects on your emotions, right? Especially when you disturb the central part of the vermis, right? This is known as cerebral cognitive affective syndrome. Just for you to know, right? But essentially, going back to this, these are the core signs of cerebellar disorders, which I'll also cover in the lecture on what do you call it?
Doctor,
Yes,
could we go to the previous slide, please?
sure. This one.
Yeah, and a question is for the gray arrows and black arrows, both are efferent connections, is it? There are no difference?
No. Gray is efferent. Hey, wait. Okay. I think there's an error in the slide. Okay, I will go back. See, essentially, the cerebellum receives afferents from a lot of these structures: spine, the cerebellum, the red nucleus, and at the same time, it works. Okay, we'll focus on this half first on the right side. See, from the brain, sometimes directly, sometimes through the olive to the cerebellum, from the hypothalamus to the cerebellum, to the pons to the cerebellum, and the outflow tract of the cerebellum through the Purkinje cells. They go back to the hypothalamus, of course. They go directly to the cerebral cortex. They go to the thalamus, right? This is for particularly for motor functions. Red nucleus, as I said, is also part involved in motor function and ocular function, and they go back to the cortex. So technically, I suppose they are all outflow tracks that you're talking about. But I suppose the black should be afferent lah, and the gray should be more accurately efferent. All right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so we have covered about the lobes of the cerebellum, right? The location in the posterior fossa, anterior lobe, posterior lobe, floccular nodular lobe, and then the functional division into the vestibulocerebellum, spinocerebellum, and cerebellocerebellum. You understand a little bit about its function. I'm not because there's so much for us to cover today. I think quintessentially knowing a bit about the lobes, the location. What I would want you all to do during your next during the session in January, where we have to actually have a session where the students will present. So one group will actually pick up the cerebellum, right? The cerebellum models that's available in USMKR, the soft models, and you're going to just sort of show it to the rest of your group members. You orientate it, talk to us, show us. Okay, this is the anterior surface, posterior surface. Which are the lobes? Which are the functions? All right. So I hope the class rep can remember this will be one of the group's assignments. So this will be what I would want you all to do when we're coming back in January. So one of the groups can pick up the cerebellum. I don't think you need too many people for this, all right? Okay, guys, do you want to take a short break before we move on to the next one?
Yes, doctor. Can we take a break for a while?
Yes, sure, please.